Hi guys! So today we are going to be taking some notes on changes that happen in ecosystems. So the last couple of weeks we've been talking about biodiversity and how there are different types of living and non-living things in an ecosystem and how those ecosystems are established and how a healthy ecosystem looks, right? It's got water, it's got sunlight, it's got soil, it's got all the things that organisms need to survive. So today we're going to talk about what those changes look like that happen in ecosystems, because a lot of ecosystems are in a state of change that's called ecological succession. Okay. So let's just remind ourselves about food chains and how important they are in an ecosystem. So if we were to remove the secondary consumer in this food chain, what would happen? So if we took the mouse out, what would happen to this secondary? What would happen if we took out that secondary consumer, that mouse? Maybe there would be a lot more grasshoppers, or maybe the owl would have to find a different food source, right? So every organism is important, right? If the secondary consumer dies, the tertiary consumer is going to not have a source of food, so they might die. Then those primary consumers are going to increase in number, and then the producers are going to decrease because those primary consumers are going to eat more plants. So all things are cause and effect when we have ecosystems. So the main thing that we're going to be focused on today is how land and aquatic ecosystems are changing over time through a predictable process called succession. So ecological succession is the process of one ecological community, one ecosystem, gradually changing into another, right? And so we're going to talk about the two main types of succession and how it's a pattern of change from one type of community, group of organisms, to another. The climax community, just like the climax in your favorite story, has everything, right? This is a stable community that's no longer going through major ecological changes, right? It's got vegetation, it's got trees, it's got plants, it's got animals, it's got a little bit of everything, okay? I didn't say this at the beginning, but you guys should be writing this in your journal. In a minute, we're going to have some content that we're going to write, and the red words you're going to highlight as you write them in your journal. So you might want to grab a highlighter if you need one. Now, a pioneer species, just like pioneers to the westward expansion of the United States, they were the first people to explore the United States, right? The first to colonize it. So they were called pioneers. Pioneer is a word that we use to talk about the first. So the first species that colonizes new or undisturbed land is a pioneer species. And these are going to be different pioneer species depending on the type of succession. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Eutrophication is the process of a body of water becoming super nutrient rich. And so a lot of times this happens because of runoff from other areas. And then those nutrients get trapped in pools sometimes and create large algae blooms, which seems really cool, like lots of algae. That seems good. Except that algae can sometimes deplete the water of the oxygen that it needs. And so eutrophication can be a natural part of an ecosystem, but it can also be a damaging part of an ecosystem. So let's talk about what we mean when we say ecological succession. Ecological succession, I want you to remember, is natural, it's gradual, it happens over a long period of time, and it means that things are changing, right? Succession, change, right? Things happening one step after another. There's changes in the types of species that live in a particular area. This, like I said a minute ago, can be a primary or secondary succession, right? There's two different types, and we're going to talk about those differences in a minute. This happens when there's a replacement of one plant community with another. So instead of having just grasses, those grasses get replaced with shrubs, and then those shrubs get replaced by trees, and then those trees get replaced by bigger and larger trees, right? And so this is a natural, gradual change to a particular ecosystem. Now, in primary succession happens in a place without any soil. So there is bare rock. And so what can grow on bare rock? How can anything live in a condition where there's only rock? There are several different places where you might see primary succession. The side of a volcano, right, where there's new rock that's been formed from that volcano. After a landslide, when there's just bare rock that's left on the side of a mountain. After a flood that washes away all of the soil that was created. If you've ever been to Enchanted Rock, that's a really great example of primary succession. And I actually went there just over spring break. So you'll see maybe some pictures of that in the next few days. So primary succession happens in a place that has bare rock and no soil. The first organisms that are going to live there are going to be things that don't need soil to grow. Lichens are a particular type of organism that are actually a combination of algae and a fungus that can grow pretty much anywhere. They can grow on bare rock. And if you've ever been to Enchanted Rock, you might see this bluish, greenish stuff that's growing on the rocks. That's lichen. Mosses are going to grow after the lichens where newly made soil is, right? After those lichens grow, they're going to die, and the makeup of the organism is going to become new soil, just like when you compost things, right? The makeup of those old organisms is going to become new soil. So mosses are going to grow, and they're going to be able to hold that soil in place so it doesn't erode. These two are examples of pioneer species for primary succession, okay? So here are pictures of lichens and mosses that are pioneer species for primary succession. Lichens are going to break down rock to form new soil, and then those mosses are going to be able to trap that moisture and keep that soil in place so that they can grow. And you often see, for example, when I was hiking at Enchanted Rock this past week, you see those mosses growing where there's like little trickles of water, right? Now, once that soil starts to form, as those lichens break down and the weather breaks down those rocks into smaller and smaller pieces that create new soil, the lichens are going to start to die, right? They're going to decompose, and they're going to add back the nutrients that were a part of their body to the rock to make a healthier soil. Here's an example of a little pool that was created. This is Mr. Queller's picture, and there's several things you can see here in this picture that show that primary succession. So if you look here, this red area, that's lichen, right? And then you see these mosses that are growing just next to it, and then you see these little wildflowers and grasses kind of in the middle. And it gets a water supply because of its position being lower than everything else. And so it's an area that is able to grow organisms because it's this kind of low pool that trapped water, that trapped soil and nutrients. As they were broken down, they were re-added back into the environment. So primary succession has simple plants like mosses and ferns that grow after those original lichens and mosses, right? They grow in the new soil because ferns don't take very much soil to survive, and neither do mosses. After those simple plants start to die, like those mosses, that soil layer gets thick, right? Because the organisms die, and then the bodies of those plants are adding nutrients back into the soil and creating more soil. And so those plants are able to have bigger plants that have a bigger root system. They're able to grow in that area, right? So that soil layer is constantly getting thicker and thicker to support organisms that have a larger root base, like a grass or a wildflower. After those plants, those grasses and wildflowers die, they're going to add back, again, more nutrients to the soil, so that then they're not only adding nutrients, but the quantity of soil is greater as well. So shrubs and trees are going to then be able to survive in that particular environment. And then we get animals, right? We get animals like insects and birds and mammals that move into an area, so that an area that was once bare rock, right, nothing was living there, can now support this big variety of living organisms. Now, secondary succession happens a little bit differently. Secondary succession happens in an area that has already had soil and already had living things. This usually happens after a devastating natural disaster, like a volcanic explosion or a wildfire, or a flood. All of these are ways that a secondary succession can start, right? These things occur very fast, well, faster than primary succession. And they're going to have a different type of pioneer species than primary succession because they already have soil, right? So in primary succession, those lichens and mosses have to create the soil for organisms to be able to live. In secondary succession, there's already soil in place. And so there's organisms with bigger roots that can already survive because there's a soil structure there. So these often happen after forest fires. California is a very common place. We're going to see secondary succession because they have natural wildfires every year. Here's kind of a visual that you can see of that very, very small, limited organisms, a little bit bigger, a little bit more shrubby, and then we have smaller trees, and then finally these large hardwoods at that climax community. Here's another one. You can see that it starts out down here with these annual weeds. Annuals are going to die off every year, and then they spread their seeds, and then they grow new ones the next year. Perennials are the same plants that keep coming back year after year. And so then you get to see those year after years coming back, and it progresses as you go. If you look down here at the bottom, you can see how many years that takes. So it can take quite a few years for a community to be restored after a natural disaster like a forest fire. Here's another example of a beach community. If you've ever been to the beach, you know that there's not big trees that just grow on the beach, right? And that's because the beach gets a lot of abuse from those waves coming in constantly. And so you get grasses and shrubs that can grow kind of at the back of the beach line. And then as you go farther inland, you get bigger trees and more of that climax community. A climax community is what we call that stable environment of plants and animals that's kind of the end result. It's the balance. It's that homeostasis for that ecosystem. It doesn't always have to be big trees, right? It depends on the biome or ecosystem that we're talking about. So if we're talking about a grassland, that's going to be healthy, thick, big grasses. That's a climax community for that ecosystem. Cacti in the desert is going to be climax community for that ecosystem, right? It just means that it's gotten to a stable position, and it's the end result of that succession, right? It's kind of the plateau. It's where everything evens out and there's less change in that environment. That's where we're going to stop for today. I hope you guys have a fantastic Monday. Welcome back from spring break, and I look forward to seeing you guys later this week.